Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. I'm so glad you could join me today for our next reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Today we'll be reading chapters 27 and 28. So, just a brief recap on what we read last time. Captain Nemo has sailed the Nautilus along with our three heroes, and they've reached the island of Ceylon, nowadays called Sri Lanka. And one of the things that he was talking about is that uh, the reefs in that area, the underwater areas in that part of the world, are rife with pearl oysters, and he invites Professor Aronnax, our narrator in this story. He invites him to take part in this, where people go diving down, collect oysters, and try and find pearls of some value. And then, very casually, as he leaves, he said, "By the way, are you afraid of sharks?" And Professor Aronnax doesn't really know what to say about that. But all of a sudden, it's the only thing he can think of, because Nemo leaves, and he then talks to his other two compatriots, and it's actually a really funny scene because while he's talking to them, he's sort of trying not to think about sharks, and ends up saying things like, "Oh, really? How much is that worth?" "Oh, about 150 sharks." And they say, "Wait, what?" And then he says, "Oh, I mean dollars. I mean dollars. Of course, sharks is ridiculous." And he does that a few times, and then, hoping that by bringing up the topic of sharks, the other two will not want to go, and then he'll be kind of off the hook. He said he agreed to this trip to the Pearl Oyster beds before he realized that there was going to be potential danger of sharks. So he talks to them a little bit, and then he very casually, just like Captain Nemo, he very casually at the end of the conversation brings up the concept. "Oh, by the way, are either of you afraid of sharks?" And of course, the funny part is that Ned Land, the harpooner, is certainly not afraid of sharks, and he would love to get his harpoon on some sharks and kill a few himself. Whereas Conseil, his Professor Aronnax's faithful manservant, says, "Wherever you go, I go. So if you're going to go with the sharks, I'm going to go with the sharks." And so Professor Aronnax has no way out, and is now obligated, because he already agreed to this, to go and visit these oyster beds. So that's where we begin. And if you are ready, we will start chapter 27, entitled A $2 Million Pearl. Night fell, and I went to bed. I slept rather badly. Sharks played an important role in my dreams. The next morning at 4 o'clock, I was awakened by the steward Captain Nemo had placed at my service. I quickly got up, dressed, and went to the lounge. Captain Nemo was waiting for me. "Are you ready, Monsieur Aronnax?" he asked. "I'm ready." "Please follow me." "What about my companions, Captain?" "They've already been awakened, and they're waiting for us." "Aren't we going to put on our diving suits?" I asked. "Not yet. I haven't allowed the Nautilus to get too near shore, and we're still fairly far from the Manar bank. But I've had the dinghy prepared. I will take us there and save us a long walk. Our diving suits are in it, and we'll put them on when we're about to start our underwater exploration." Captain Nemo led me toward the central companionway leading up to the platform. Ned and Conseil were there, delighted by the pleasure trip they were about to take. The dinghy was tied alongside the Nautilus, and 5 sailors were in it with their oars in place, waiting for us. It was still night. Patches of clouds covered the sky, and I could only make out a few stars. I looked toward the land, but I only saw a vague line running along 3/4 of the horizon from the southwest to the northwest. During the night, the Nautilus had sailed up the western coast of Ceylon and was now on the other side of the bay, or rather gulf, formed by this island and Manar Island. It was in these dark waters that lay the oyster beds, that inexhaustible field of pearls that stretched for more than 20 miles. Captain Nemo, Conseil, Ned Land, and I took our places in the stern of the dinghy. The coxswain held the tiller, and his 4 companions took up their oars. The ropes mooring us were released, and we were off. The dinghy headed south. The oarsmen did not hurry. I noticed that although they pulled vigorously, they waited 10 seconds between strokes, according to the system used in most navies. When their oars were in the air, drops of water would fall off and crackle on the dark surface of the ocean like bits of molten lead. A light swell coming from the open sea made the dinghy roll slightly, and several wave crests slapped against its bow. We were silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking? Perhaps about the shore we were approaching, and which he felt to be too near, unlike the Canadian, who felt it was still too far away. As for Conseil, he had come along merely out of curiosity. Toward 5:30, the first glimmers of dawn outlined the horizon more clearly. Toward the east it was rather flat, and then toward the south it rose a bit. The island was 5 miles away, and its shore still blended with the misty waters. Between us and the land, the sea was deserted. Not a single boat or diver was in sight. A profound silence reigned in this meeting place of pearl fishermen. As Captain Nemo had said, we had arrived in these waters a month too soon. At 6, daylight was suddenly upon us, with that rapidity peculiar to tropic regions, where there is no real dawn or twilight. The sun's rays pierced the cloud banks piled up on the horizon, and the sun itself rose rapidly. I could now clearly make out the shore, with a few trees spread out here and there. The dinghy continued on toward Manar Island, rising up to the south. Captain Nemo stood up and looked at the sea. He then gave the order to drop anchor. But scarcely any chain had to be let out, for this was one of the shallowest spots in the entire oyster bed, and the water was little more than 3 feet deep. The dinghy immediately swung around in the ebb tide. "Here we are, Monsieur Aronnax," said Captain Nemo. "You see this narrow bay? In a month it will be filled with fishermen and their boats, and it is in these waters that they will so bravely dive. This bay is well suited for such fishing. It's sheltered from strong winds, and there's never much of a swell, all of which is very helpful to the divers. Now, let's put on our suits and begin our excursion." I did not answer, and while the sailors helped me put on my diving suit, I looked at these questionable waters. Captain Nemo and my 2 companions were also getting dressed. None of the men from the Nautilus were going to accompany us on this new excursion. Soon we were imprisoned up to our necks in our rubber suits, and our air tanks were fixed on our backs. As for the Ruhmkorff lamps, they were not in sight. I mentioned this to Captain Nemo before my head was encased in its copper helmet. "We won't need them," he answered. "We won't be going very deep, and therefore the sun's rays will be enough to light our way. Besides, it wouldn't be wise to take an electric lamp along with us. Its light might have the unfortunate effect of attracting some of those dangerous inhabitants of these waters." As Captain Nemo said this, I turned to Conseil and Ned Land, but their heads were already inside their helmets, and they could neither hear nor answer. I had one last question to ask Captain Nemo. "What about our guns?" "Guns? What good would they do? Don't your mountaineers attack bears with a dagger? Isn't steel safer than lead? Here's a sturdy knife. Put it in your belt and let's be off. I looked at my companions. They were armed like us, and moreover, Ned Land was wielding an enormous harpoon he had put in the dinghy before leaving the Nautilus. I then followed the captain's example and allowed my heavy copper helmet to be put on. Our air reserves immediately started functioning. A moment later, the sailors helped us overboard, one after another, and we found ourselves standing on a sandy bottom in about 5 feet of water. Captain Nemo motioned for us to follow him, and we went down a gentle slope and disappeared below the surface. Once I was underwater, my fears vanished. I became astonishingly calm. The ease with which I could move increased my confidence, and the strangeness of the spectacle captivated my imagination. The sun was already lighting up the water enough to make the tiniest objects visible. After walking for 10 minutes, we found ourselves at a depth of 16 feet, and the terrain leveled off almost immediately. Schools of strange fish of the genus Monopteridae, whose tail is their only fin, flew up from beneath our feet like flocks of snipe in a marsh. I also recognized a Java fish, a veritable 2.5-foot serpent with a pale belly, which, except for the golden stripes on its side, would be easy to mistake for a conger. Among the genus Stromatiidae, characterized by a short, compressed, oval-shaped body, I noticed some species decked in gorgeous colors, carrying their dorsal fin like a scythe. These fish are edible, and when dried and marinated, they make an excellent dish known as karawade. I also saw some tranquebar fish, along with belonging to the genus Apsiphoridae, whose bodies were covered with a scaly armor in 8 longitudinal sections. The sun lit up the waters more and more as it slowly rose in the sky. The terrain changed little by little. The fine-grained sand had given way to a veritable paving of smooth rocks covered with a carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Among other specimens of these two subkingdoms, I noticed some Placidae with their thin, unequal valves, a kind of oyster found only in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Orange-colored Lucinae with their round shells, all shaped terebellum, several of those Persian purpura, which furnished a marvelous dye for the Nautilus, horned murices, 6 inches long, erect in the water, like hands ready to seize us, Cornigerous turbinelle, bristling with spines, Lingulae, Anatinae, and an edible mollusk found in the markets of Hindustan, somewhat luminous Pelagian Panopyrae, and finally superb flabelliform Osculinae, marvelous fans which form one of the most remarkable tree-like growths in the ocean. In the midst of these living plants and beneath these arbors of hydrophytes ran legions of clumsy articulata, mainly frog crabs, whose shell is shaped like a somewhat rounded triangle, birgi, found only in these waters, and horrible, repulsive-looking parthenopes. Another, no less hideous animal, which I met several times, was that enormous crab Darwin saw, a creature which nature has given the instinct and necessary strength to live off coconuts. It climbs up trees next to the shore, knocks down a coconut, which breaks open upon hitting the ground, and then opens it with its powerful claws. Here, beneath the clear water, this crab scampered about with unbelievable agility, while green turtles of a species commonly found off the coasts of Malabar moved slowly among the tumble-down rocks. Towards 7 o'clock, we finally reached an area where pearl oysters reproduce by the millions. These precious mollusks were clinging to rocks, stuck by the brown byssus which prevents them from moving about. In this, they are inferior to mussels, who can move around to a small extent. The pearl oyster, the Malagrina, whose valves are more or less equal, has a round, thick shell with a gnarled exterior. Several of these shells were marked with green bands radiating down from the top. These were the young oysters. But those that were black and rough were almost 10 years old and measured as much as 6 inches in diameter. Captain Nemo pointed to an enormous mass of pearl oysters, and I realized that here there was a literally inexhaustible supply, for nature's creative force was stronger than man's destructive instinct. But Ned Land, faithful to his instinct, was quickly filling a sack with the finest oysters. However, we could not stop. We had to follow the captain, who seemed to be taking paths known only to him. The ocean floor rose considerably, and sometimes I could raise my arm above the surface. Then it would get deeper again. Often we would go around high rocks shaped like pyramids. In the darker hollows of their craggy surface, large crustaceans were perched on their legs like war machines, looking at us with their set eyes. About our feet crawled Myrianidae, Ariceae, Annelidae, stretching out their antennae and tentacles. Just then, a vast cave appeared before us, hollowed out in a picturesque pile of rock covered with all the lovely tapestry work of underwater vegetation. At first it seemed to me very dark inside this cave. The sun's rays appeared to lose their strength little by little. Their vague transparency became only a dim, blurred light. Captain Nemo entered, and we followed. My eyes soon became accustomed to the relative darkness. I could make out natural pillars supporting a whimsically shaped vaulting and resting on a granite base, like the heavy columns of Tuscan architecture. Why was our strange guide taking us into the depths of this underwater crypt? I was soon to know. After going down a rather steep slope, we found ourselves standing at the bottom of a sort of circular pit, where Captain Nemo stopped and pointed to something I had not noticed. It was an oyster of amazing size, a giant clam which could have made a holy water basin big enough to hold a lake. It was 7 feet wide, and therefore even bigger than the one in the Nautilus's lounge. I went over to this phenomenal mollusk. He was fastened to a slab of granite, living all alone in the calm waters of the grotto. I calculated that this giant clam must have weighed about 650 pounds. Such an oyster must have contained 35 pounds of flesh, and it would have taken the stomach of a gargantua to digest several dozen of these. It was obvious Captain Nemo already knew this creature was here. It wasn't the first time he had paid it a visit. But I was wrong in thinking that he had brought us here just to show us a wonder of nature. Captain Nemo had a particular reason for wanting to see how this giant clam was getting along. The creature's 2 valves were partly open. The captain inserted his finger to prevent them from closing again. Then, with his hand, he lifted up the fringed membranes which formed the animal's cloak. There, among the leaf-like folds, I saw a loose pearl the size of a coconut. Its roundness, perfect clarity, and marvelous sheen made it a jewel of incalculable value. I was carried away by my curiosity and stretched out my hand to take it, weigh it, and feel it, but the captain stopped me and indicated that he did not want me to touch it. He then removed his dagger with one swift motion, and the two valves of the clam suddenly closed. I then realized what Captain Nemo had in mind. By allowing this pearl to remain inside the giant clam, he could let it grow as much as he wanted. Each year, the creature would add new layers to it. Only the captain knew where this marvelous fruit of nature was ripening. He alone was bringing it up, one might say, so that one day he might take it to his precious museum. He might even have started the growth of this pearl, as they do in China and India, by placing some piece of glass or metal inside the giant clam and allowing this object to become covered with the creature's pearl-forming secretions. In any case, by comparing this pearl with others I knew, and with those in the captain's collection, I estimated it to be worth at least $2 million. But it was more a wonder of nature than a piece of jewelry, for I can't imagine what woman's ear could support such a weight. The visit to the giant clam was over. Captain Nemo left the cave, and we went back up to the oyster beds in the midst of clear waters not yet disturbed by the work of divers. We walked alone, like people out for a stroll, each one stopping or wandering off whenever he wished. As for me, I was no longer a bit troubled by the dangers which my imagination had so ridiculously exaggerated. The ocean floor rose up, and soon I was walking at a depth of 4 feet, with my head out of the water. Conseil joined me, and putting his helmet alongside mine, made a friendly gesture with his eyes. But this raised plateau lasted only for several yards, and soon we were back in our element. For I feel I could now call it our element. 10 minutes later, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I thought we were going to start back, but no. He motioned for us to squat down beside him in a crevasse. He pointed to a place in the water, and I looked hard to try and discover what it was he saw. About 15 feet away, a shadow appeared and descended to the ocean floor. The disturbing idea that it might be a shark crossed my mind, but I was wrong, and as yet we were not face to face with one of these monsters of the deep. It was a man, a live man, an Indian, a poor devil of a fisherman who had undoubtedly come to gather what he could before harvest time. I could make out the bottom of his rowboat anchored several feet above my head. He would dive and then go back up, time after time. A round stone, which he clutched with his feet, and which was tied to the boat by a rope, helped him to get to the bottom more quickly. This was his only implement. Once down, in about 15 feet of water, he would drop to his knees and fill his sack with whatever oysters lay at hand. Then he would go back up, empty his sack, bring the stone up, and then start the process, which lasted about 30 seconds, all over again. This diver did not see us. We were hidden in the shadow of a rock, and besides, how could this poor Indian ever have imagined that men, creatures like himself, were there beneath the surface, spying on him and observing every detail of his work? Every time he dove, he would only bring back 10 or 12 oysters, for they had to be torn from the rocks to which they were so strongly fastened, and then how many of these oysters were completely lacking in those pearls for which he was risking his life? I watched him very closely. He went up and down in a regular rhythm, and for half an hour no danger seemed to threaten him. I was therefore becoming very familiar with this interesting mode of fishing, when suddenly, while the Indian was kneeling down, I saw him make a gesture of fright, get up, and start back to the surface. And I then understood his terror. A gigantic shadow appeared above him. It was a huge shark, moving in with fire in his eyes and his jaws open. I was paralyzed with horror, incapable of moving. With one powerful movement of its fins, this voracious creature shot toward the Indian, who jumped to the side and avoided the animal's bite. But he did not manage to avoid the tail, which struck him on the chest and knocked him flat on the ocean floor. This scene had lasted no more than several seconds. Then the shark came back, turned over, and was getting ready to cut the Indian in two, when the captain suddenly jumped up next to me. With his dagger in hand, he made straight for the monster, ready to fight it hand to hand. Just as the shark was about to seize the unfortunate diver, he saw his new adversary, righted himself, and swam rapidly toward him. I can still see Captain Nemo's stance, bracing himself for the struggle. He coolly awaited the formidable shark, and just as this creature was almost on him, he sidestepped with incredible speed, thus avoiding the jaws, and buried his dagger in the animal's belly. But it did not end there. A terrible struggle began. The shark almost seemed as if it were bellowing. Blood poured from its wounds. The sea turned red. And through this murkiness, I could see nothing. Nothing until through a clear spot in the water I made out the brave captain, clutching one of the animal's fins, fighting with it, riddling its body with blows from his dagger, but without being able to finish it off, that is to say, strike it in the heart. The shark churned the water so furiously that it came close to knocking me over. I would have liked to help the captain, but I was rooted to the spot by horror and I could not move. I merely looked on with dread. I saw the struggle take a new turn. The captain fell to the ground, knocked over by the enormous creature's weight. Then the shark's jaws opened like some huge shearing machine, and the captain would have been done for if Ned Land had not rushed forward as quick as lightning and hurled his harpoon at the fish. Masses of blood darkened the water. The shark thrashed about with indescribable fury. Ned Land had struck home. This was the monster's death rattle. However, it struggled on, and in one of its horrifying convulsions, it knocked Conseil down. But Ned Land had freed the captain. The latter, unharmed, immediately got up and went over to the Indian, cut the rope tying him to the rock, took him in his arms, and with one strong kick, brought him back to the surface. All three of us followed, and in a moment, feeling as if we had been saved by a miracle, we reached the fisherman's boat. Captain Nemo's first preoccupation was to bring the poor fellow back to life. I did not know if he would succeed. I was hopeful in any case, for the Indian had not been under long, but the blow from the shark's tail could have been fatal. But fortunately, with Conseil and the captain giving him artificial respiration, he soon regained consciousness and opened his eyes. How surprised he must have been to see our 4 copper helmets bending over him. But above all, what must he have thought when Captain Nemo pulled a bag of pearls from the pocket of his diving suit and put them in his hand? The poor Indian accepted these alms from the man of the sea with a trembling hand. We could see by his startled eyes that he did not know to what kind of Superman he owed both life and his good fortune. At a sign from the captain, we returned to the oyster bed and retraced our steps. Within a half an hour, we had found the anchor holding the Nautilus's dinghy. Once we were in the boat, the sailors helped us take off our heavy copper helmets. Captain Nemo's first words were spoken to the Canadian. "Thank you, Master Land," he said. "I was just repaying a debt," Ned answered. A vague smile played on the captain's lips, and that was all. "To the Nautilus," he said. The little boat sped over the water. Several minutes later we came across the floating carcass of the shark. By the black coloring on the tips of the fins, I could see that it belonged to the terrible Melanopteron species of the Indian Ocean. It was more than 25 feet long, and its enormous mouth occupied a third of its body. By its 6 rows of teeth, I could tell that it was an adult. Conseil was looking at it in a purely scientific way, and I'm sure he was classifying it quite correctly among the class of cartilaginous fish, order of Chondropterygii, with fixed gills, family of Selaceae, genus of Squali. While I was looking at this inert mass, a dozen other sharks of the same species suddenly appeared around the boat. They threw themselves on the carcass and fought over the pieces without even giving us a thought. At 8:30, we were back on board the Nautilus. Once we were there, I reflected on our excursion to the Mannar beds. 2 thoughts inevitably came to mind. One concerned the captain's unparalleled courage, and the other his devotion for a human being, a representative of that race from which he was fleeing beneath the ocean. Whatever one might say, this strange man had not succeeded in entirely burying his heart. When I mentioned this, he answered in a somewhat trembling voice. "This Indian, Professor, lives in the land of the oppressed, and to that land I still belong, and shall till the day I die." Chapter 28, The Red Sea. During the day of January 29th, the island of Ceylon disappeared beneath the horizon, and the Nautilus, traveling at a speed of 20 knots, entered the winding channel separating the Maldive and the Laccadive Islands. It even cruised near Kiltan Island, which is of coral origin and which was discovered by Vasco da Gama in 1499. It is one of the 19 principal islands of the Laccadive archipelago, which is situated between 10 degrees and 14 degrees 30 minutes north latitude and 69 degrees and 50 degrees 72 minutes east longitude. We had then traveled 16,220 miles, or, in other words, 7,500 leagues from our point of departure in the Sea of Japan. The next day, January 30th, there was no longer any land in sight when the Nautilus surfaced. It was heading north by northwest toward the Gulf of Oman, which lies between Arabia and the Indian Peninsula and through which one enters the Persian Gulf. This was obviously a dead end without any possible way out. Where was Captain Nemo taking us? I had no idea. But this did not satisfy the Canadian when he asked me where we were going. "Ned, we're going wherever the captain takes into his head to go." "But that can't be far," replied the Canadian. "There's no other way out of the Persian Gulf, and if we enter it, we'll soon have to come back the way we went." "Well, then we'll come back, Ned. But if the Nautilus, after that, wants to visit the Red Sea, the Straits of Bab el Mandeb are always there for it to pass through." "I don't think I need to tell you, monsieur," replied Ned Land, "that the Red Sea is just as much of a dead end as the Persian Gulf. The Suez Canal isn't finished yet, and even if it were, a mysterious boat like ours wouldn't dare travel through it. So that means we won't get back to Europe by means of the Red Sea either." "I didn't say we were heading for Europe." Where do you suppose we're going, then? My guess is that after visiting the waters off Arabia and Egypt, the Nautilus will go back to the Indian Ocean, travel either through the Mozambique Channel, or off the Mascarene Islands, and then head for the Cape of Good Hope. And what will happen once we get to the Cape of Good Hope? Asked the Canadian stubbornly. We'll enter the Atlantic, which we haven't yet visited. But what's the matter, Ned? Are you getting tired of this undersea voyage? Are you getting bored with the continually varying spectacle of underwater wonders? As for me, I'll be sorry to see the end of a voyage like this, which so few men have had the opportunity to make. But don't you realize, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the Canadian, that soon it'll be 3 months since we became prisoners on board the Nautilus? No, Ned, I don't. And what's more, I don't even want to think about it. I don't want to count the days and hours. But when will it all end? When the time has come for it to end. Besides, there's nothing we can do about it, and it's useless even to discuss the matter. If you came to me and said, now's our chance to escape, I wouldn't argue with you. But this isn't the case. And to tell you the truth, I don't think Captain Nemo will ever venture into European waters. One can see by this short dialogue that I had become a fanatic on the subject of the Nautilus, and had begun to identify with its captain. Ned Land ended the conversation muttering to himself, "That's all fine and good, but the way I look at it, a man can't live without his freedom." For 4 days, till February 3rd, the Nautilus visited the Gulf of Oman at various speeds and depths. It seemed to be cruising at random, as if it couldn't decide what route to take, but it never crossed the Tropic of Cancer. As we left the Gulf, we sighted Muscat, and for a moment, the most important town in this area. I looked admiringly at its strange appearance, its white houses and fortifications contrasting with the black rocks surrounding it. I could make out the round domes of its mosques, the elegant spires of its minarets, and its fresh green terraces. But I got only a glimpse, for the Nautilus soon dove beneath the dark waters. It then cruised 6 miles off the Arabian coast near the regions of Mara and Hadramaut, with their line of mountains dotted here and there with ancient ruins. On February 5th, we finally entered the Gulf of Aden, a perfect funnel stuck in the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, through which the waters of the Indian Ocean pass into the Red Sea. On February 6th, the Nautilus was within sight of Aden, perched on its promontory and joined to the mainland by a narrow isthmus, a kind of inaccessible Gibraltar, whose fortifications the English rebuilt after capturing it in 1839. I could make out the 8-sided minarets of this town, which, according to the historian Idrissi, used to be one of the richest commercial centers along the entire coast. I was sure that Captain Nemo would now turn back, but I was wrong, and to my great surprise, he did quite the opposite. On the next day, February 7th, we entered the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, whose name in Arabic means the Gates of Tears. They are 20 miles wide and 32 miles long, and it took the Nautilus, traveling at top speed, scarcely an hour to pass through them. But I saw nothing, not even Perim Island, which the British government used to help defend Aden. Too many English or French steamers of the lines going from Suez to Bombay, Calcutta, Melbourne, Reunion, Mauritius, supplied this narrow passage for the Nautilus to dare show itself. We therefore cruised underwater. Finally, at noon, we were in the Red Sea. The Red Sea, so famous from biblical times, is hardly ever refreshed by rains and is replenished by no important rivers. In addition, it is continually drained by a high rate of evaporation, which causes it to lose 5 feet of water a year. A strange gulf which, if it were closed off like a lake, would probably have dried up completely, unlike its neighbors, the Caspian and Dead Seas, whose water levels have dropped precisely to the point where their evaporation equals the amount of water entering them. The Red Sea is 1,600 miles long and has an average width of 150 miles. In the days of the Ptolemies and the Roman emperors, it was the great commercial artery of the world, and when the canal is completed, it will once again regain its former importance, which has already been partly restored by the Suez Railway. I did not even try to understand why Captain Nemo had taken us into this gulf, but I approved wholeheartedly of the Nautilus's having entered. It traveled at a slow speed, sometimes on the surface and sometimes underwater, to avoid ships. I was therefore able to observe this sea inside and out. On February 8th, during the first moments of daylight, we sighted Mocha, a town now in ruins, whose walls would collapse at the mere sound of a cannon, but in which there are still some scattered green date palms. Once upon a time it was a city of considerable importance, containing 6 public markets, 26 mosques, and its walls defended by 14 forts, were 2 miles in circumference. Then the Nautilus drew nearer the shores of Africa, where the sea is considered considerably deeper. There, as the ship traveled through crystal clear water, we could see through the open panels in the lounge marvelous shrubs of dazzling coral and huge chunks of rock covered with a splendid green fur of seaweed and of sea wrack. What an indescribable spectacle, and what a variety of beautiful landscapes at the edge of these reefs and volcanic islands off the coast of Libya. But the Nautilus soon went back to the eastern shores, where we could see these tree-like formations in all their glory. It was near the coast of Tehama, for there not only did masses of zoophytes flower beneath the surface, but they also formed picturesque networks of heights up of 60 feet above water level. The latter were more whimsical in shape, but less rich in color than the former, whose hues were kept vivid by the surrounding water. How many delightful hours I passed looking through the window of the lounge! How many new specimens of underwater flora and fauna was I able to admire beneath the rays of our electric light! I saw mushroom-shaped fungi, slate-colored sea anemones, among others, the Thalassianthus aster, organ-pipe corals shaped like flutes and awaiting only to be played by the god Pan. Shells found only in these waters, which were spiral-shaped at the base and which lay in hollows in the madreporic formations. And finally, thousands of specimens of polypary, which I had not yet seen, the ordinary sponge. The class of Spongiaria, the first within the division of the polyps, is constituted by this curious and useful product. The sponge is not a plant, as some naturalists still claim, but an animal of the lowest order, inferior even to coral. There can be no doubt about its animal nature, and one cannot even go along with scientists of ancient times who said that it was halfway between plant and animal. I must say, however, that naturalists do not agree as to the structures of sponges. For some, it is a polypary, and for others, like Milne Edwards, it is in a category all by itself. The class of Spongiaria contains about 300 species. They are found in most areas and even in certain rivers, in which case they are called fluviatile. But mainly they are found in the Mediterranean, around the Greek islands, and off the coast of Syria, and in the Red Sea. There are encounters of the fine sponges, which are worth up to $30 apiece. The blonde Syrian sponges, the hard sponge of Barbary, etc. But since I had no hope of studying these zoophytes in the Mediterranean, I was contented to observe them in the Red Sea. I therefore told Conseil to join me while the Nautilus at a depth of 25 to 30 feet cruised slowly past all the beautiful rocks near the eastern coast. There were sponges growing in all sorts of shapes. Pediculate, leaf-like, round, and finger-shaped. They well justified the names given them by fishermen who were better poets than scientists. Basket sponges, chalice sponges, cat's tails, elk's horns, lion's feet, peacock's tails, and Neptune's gloves. From their fibrous tissue, impregnated with a semi-fluid gelatinous substance, there escaped a steady stream of water which, after bringing life-giving matter to each cell, was expelled by a contracting movement. This gelatinous substance disappears after the polyp dies, letting forth ammonia as it rots. Then nothing is left but the horny or soft reddish-brown fibers, which make up the household sponge, and which are put to various uses according to their degree of elasticity or permeability. These polyparies were stuck to rocks, to the shells of mollusks, and even to the stems of hydrophytes. They decorated every twist and turn of the rocks, some spreading out, some standing up straight, and others hanging like outgrowths of coral. I told Conseil that there were two ways of fishing for sponges, dredging or diving, and that the latter was preferable because it did not harm the fibers of the polypary, therefore reducing its value. The other zoophytes swarming around the Spongiaria consisted principally of a very elegant kind of jellyfish. Mollusks were represented by a species of squid, which, according to D'Orbigny, are found only in the Red Sea, and reptiles were represented by Virgata turtles of the genus Chelonia, which furnished us with a healthy and excellent food. As for fish, they were numerous and often remarkable. Here are those which the Nautilus's nets most frequently hauled in. Among rays, I noticed some oval-shaped, brick-colored limae, their bodies covered with a different-sized blue spots, recognizable by their jagged double stingers, silver-backed arnacks, whip-tailed stingrays, and 6-foot-long bulkheads, which looked like huge overcoats flapping about in the water. I also saw eodons without a single tooth, even though they are a different relative of the shark, 18-inch long trunk fishes whose camel-like hump ends in a bent spine. Phidions, looking like morays with their silver tails, bluish backs, and brown pectoral fins edged in gray. Pheotole, a species of Stromatidae, striped with narrow gold bands and decked in the colors of the French flag. Blennies, 16 inches long. Superb caranxes, decorated with 7 black cross stripes, blue and yellow fins, and scales of gold and silver, centropods, a kind of mullet with a yellow head, parrotfish, wrasse, triggerfish, gobies, etc., and thousands of other fish I had already seen in other waters. On February 9th, the Nautilus cruised through the widest part of the Red Sea, lying between Suakin on the west coast and Kenfuda on the east coast, a distance of 190 miles. At noon that day, after our position had been taken, Captain Nemo came up on the platform. I promised myself not to let him go back down without at least having sounded him out on his plans. He came over as soon as he saw me, graciously offered me a cigar, and said, "Well, Professor, how do you like the Red Sea? Have you seen enough of the wonders it contains, its fish, its zoophytes, sponges, and coral forests? Have you had a look at the towns spread out on its shores?" "Yes, Captain Nemo," I replied, "and the Nautilus is marvelously fit for such a study. What a remarkable boat!" "Yes, monsieur, it is completely invulnerable. It has nothing to fear from the terrible storms, currents, or reefs of the Red Sea." "As a matter of fact," I said, "the Red Sea is supposed to be one of the worst seas on earth. In ancient times, it had a terrible reputation." "Terrible, Monsieur Aronnax? Greek and Latin historians have little good to say for it, and Strabo states that it is particularly rough when the Etesian winds are blowing and during the rainy season. The Arab Idrisi, who refers to it as the Gulf of Kulzum, says that many ships perished on its sandbanks, and that no one dared to sail on it at night. He says it is a sea subject so terrible to terrible storms. Okay, let's try that again. He says it is subject to terrible storms, strewn with forbidding islands, and with nothing to offer, either below or above the surface. One finds the same opinions in Arian, Agatha Archides, and Artemidorus. One can easily see, I said, that these historians hadn't sailed on the Nautilus. "Yes," replied the captain with a smile, "but as far as that is concerned, modern men are no further along than the ancients. It took many centuries to discover the mechanical power of steam. Who knows if we will send a second Nautilus within 100 years? Excuse me. Progress is a slow thing, Monsieur Aronnax." "You are right," I replied. "Your boat is one, or maybe several centuries ahead of its time. What a pity that such a secret should die with its inventor." Captain Nemo did not answer. After several minutes of silence, he said, "We were discussing, I think, what ancient historians said about the dangers of navigation in the Red Sea." "Ah, yes," I replied, "but weren't their fears a bit exaggerated?" "Yes and no, Monsieur Aronnax," said Captain Nemo, who seemed to know his Red Sea by heart. "What is no longer a danger for a modern ship that is well rigged, solidly built, and in control of its direction thanks to steam power, offered all kinds of perils to olden vessels. You must realize that these first navigators went out in boats made of planks lashed together with palm ropes, caulked with ground resin and coated with dogfish grease. They didn't even have the instruments to tell them what direction they were going in, and they navigated by guesswork amid currents they hardly knew. Under such conditions, there were necessarily many shipwrecks, But nowadays, steamers plying between Suez and the South Seas have nothing to fear from the fury of this Gulf. In spite of the monsoons which blow up from the south, their captains and passengers no longer make sacrifices to appease the gods before leaving, nor do they dress in garlands and gold headbands to thank the gods upon returning. Yes, I said, steam navigation seems to have killed the gratitude in sailors' hearts. But, Captain, since you seem to have made a special study of this sea, could you tell me the origin of its name? There are many explanations for it, Monsieur Aronnax. Would you like to know the opinion of a 14th century chronicler? Yes. This writer tries to maintain that it got its name after the passage of the Israelites when Pharaoh perished in the waters which closed in at Moses' command. As a token of this wonder, when the sea was rent asunder, turning red, it then was known by the color it had shown. That's very poetic, Captain Nemo, I answered, but it is not a very satisfactory explanation. What is your own opinion? My opinion, Monsieur Aronnax, is that its name is a translation of the Hebrew word Edrem, and that the ancients gave it this name because of the peculiar color of its waters. But until now, at least, I haven't seen anything but clear, colorless water. Undoubtedly, but as you go toward the head of the Gulf, you'll see this strange phenomenon. I can remember having seen the Bay of Tor completely red, like a lake of blood. Do you attribute this color to the presence of some microscopic plant? Yes. It's a purple, sticky substance produced by tiny little plants called trichotomids, of which it takes 40,000 to fill up the space of a square millimeter. Maybe you'll see this phenomenon when we get to Tor. So this isn't your first time you've taken the Nautilus down to the Red Sea? No, monsieur. Then, since a while ago you mentioned the passage of the Israelites and the catastrophe that overtook the Egyptians, I would like to know if, with your submarine, you have been able to discover the site of the great historic event. No, Professor, and there is a good reason why I haven't. Why? Because the place where Moses crossed with all his people is so covered with sand that nowadays camels can scarcely even wet their legs there. As you can see, it wouldn't be quite enough water for my Nautilus to float in. And where is this place? It is situated a little above Suez, within that sound which once formed a deep estuary in the days when the Red Sea stretched to the Salt Lakes. Now, whether or not this passage was a miracle, it was precisely there that the Israelites crossed to reach the Promised Land, and that Pharaoh's army perished. I therefore think that if archaeologists dug in among these sands, they would find a great quantity of arms and utensils of Egyptian origin. Obviously, I replied, and one can only hope for the archaeologists' sake that this work will be done someday. When new towns spring up after the Suez Canal is completed. But speaking of this canal, even when it is finished, it won't be of much use to a ship like the Nautilus. No, but very useful for the rest of the world, said Captain Nemo. People in ancient times understood only too well how important it was for commerce to connect the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, but they did not think of digging a direct canal, and instead it did it by way of the Nile. And if one can believe traditional accounts, the canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea probably began under Sesostris. In any case, it is certain that in 615 BC, Nikos started work on a canal which was fed by Nile water and crossed the plains of Egypt opposite Arabia. It took 4 days to travel the length of this canal, and it was wide enough for 2 triremes to pass side by side. It was continued by Darius, son of Hitaspe, and probably finished by Ptolemy II. Strabo saw it used for shipping, but because it sloped gently down from Bubastis into the Red Sea, it was only usable for several months a year. This canal served commerce until the period of the Antonine emperors. It was then abandoned and became sanded over until it was finally put back into use by the Caliph Omar. And when it was filled in once and for all in 762 or 761 or 762 by Caliph al-Mansur in order to prevent Muhammad ben Abdallah, who had rebelled against him, from receiving supplies. During Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, he discovered traces of these canals in the desert near Suez, and while searching for them was overtaken by the tide and almost drowned several hours before reaching Hajorath, where Moses had camped 3,000 years before. Well, Captain, what the ancients did not dare undertake, this junction of 2 seas, which will shorten the route from Cadiz to India by 5,600 miles, de Lesseps is now doing, and before long he will have changed Africa into an immense island. Yes, Monsieur Aronnax, and you have the right to be proud of your compatriot. Such a man honors a country even more than a great sea captain. Like so many others, he at first only encountered difficulties and refusals, but in the end he triumphed. For he has the will of a genius, and it is a sad thought that this work, which should have been done by an international body, and which would have been enough to make one country proud, succeeded thanks to the efforts of a single man. All honor to Monsieur de Lesseps. Yes, all honor to a great man, I answered, completely taken aback by the manner in which Captain Nemo had spoken. Unfortunately, he went on, I shan't be able to take you through the Suez Canal, but you will be able to see the long jetties of Port Said when we arrive in the Mediterranean the day after tomorrow. In the Mediterranean, I cried. Yes, Professor, does that surprise you? What surprises me is the thought that we'll be there the day after tomorrow. Really? Yes, Captain, even though scarcely anything surprises me anymore aboard your ship. But just what is it that surprises you? The fantastic speed at which the Nautilus will have to travel if it is to be in the Mediterranean the day after tomorrow and after going all the way around Africa by way of the Cape of Good Hope. But who said we were going around Africa, Professor? Why bring up the Cape of Good Hope? But unless the Nautilus can sail over dry land and cross the isthmus, or under it, Monsieur Aronnax? Under it? Yes, replied Captain Nemo calmly. A long time ago, beneath this strip of land, nature did the same thing man is doing now on the surface. What? There's a passage? Yes, an underground passage which I have called the Arabian Tunnel. It starts beneath the Suez and ends in the Gulf of Pelusium. But the Isthmus of Suez is made of shifting sand. Only to a certain depth, 150 feet down, one meets a layer of solid rock. Did you discover this passage by chance? I asked, more and more surprised. By both chance and logic, Professor, and more by logic than by chance. I was listening, Captain. But my ears can scarcely believe what they hear. Ah, monsieur, they have ears, but they hear not. It is an eternal truth. Not only does this passage exist, but I have used it several times. If not, I never would have wandered into such a dead end as the Red Sea. Would it be asking too much to know how you discovered this tunnel? Monsieur, answered the captain, there can be no secrets between people who will never part. I paid attention to this insinuation and awaited Captain Nemo's account. Professor, it was simple naturalist's logic that led me to discover this hitherto unknown passage. I had noticed that the Red Sea and the Mediterranean contained certain identical species of fish, ophidians, fiatole, girelles, persidae, joels, exosuenti. Knowing this, I began to wonder if there didn't exist some passage between the two seas. If it did exist, the underground current must necessarily flow from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean because of their different levels. I therefore hauled up a large number of fish around Suez, slipped a brass ring around their tails, and threw them back in the water. Several months later, off the coast of Syria, I caught several specimens of my fish with their rings. I had therefore proved that there existed some passage between the two seas. I looked for it with my Nautilus, found it, and explored it. And very soon now, Professor, you too will have traveled through my Arabian Tunnel. And on that, as the conclusion of chapter 28, and we will read more about that on our next reading, which will be Friday at 4 p.m. We'll catch up then and see what happens to our heroes as they travel into another unknown part of the ocean. Thank you very much for joining me. We went a little bit over today. It was a little bit of a longer chapter, but thank you for sticking it out. If you were with me this whole time, I appreciate that. We'll see you again on Friday, and tomorrow we'll have another of our submarines throughout history posts on our Facebook page. So check that out if you're like me and you're kind of interested in seeing how historical submarines sort of made it to the point where they have become the ones that we are familiar with now. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you on Friday. Thanks, everyone.